Okay, so look at some of the old psychological theories of language, just a kind of a historical view here. It used to be thought that language was pretty much like everything else that we learned. Skinner, in particular, in verbal behaviour, put forward the proposition that learning language was basically the same kind of psychological mechanisms involved in learning language as you would find, a rat learning to forage for food, or humans learning how to play a simple game. It was just basically stimulus, response, reinforcement, that kind of stuff. And he put this out in Verbal Behaviour, a book, Verbal Behaviour, which was published in 1957. He essentially said that the way in which we learn language, or kids learn language, is that we learn to associate a word, on the other hand, with a sound. It's just kind of in a similar kind of way to the way that a dog might have learned to associate a bell with the presence of food. Therefore, you get a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. The parent points at a dog, for example, and says, "Dog," and the child, over a period of time, will learn that dog and the sound dog and the animal dog are associated, and that's how these simple things are learned. Dead easy, but completely wrong, because of course humans in language have to do more than simply learn to associate sounds with objects. Sentences can contain many kinds of words like it and an, which don't really have any real world reference. You can't point at an an or an it or that or from. They're just words that specify certain kind of aspects of language, not objects. And even if you look at the very simple case of just simply learning nouns like dog, it's more complicated than Skinner thought, which I won't go into that. So it's actually completely incorrect, and it doesn't really help us understand how we learn even simple nouns. But also there are many other words and many other syntactic and grammatical functions that we may perform, which this theory is completely silent about. Now, to his credit, Skinner recognised this in later life and said, absolutely right, bang to rights. I tried to make an effort here, made an attempt to explain it. Turned out I was wrong, but at least I tried, which is, I guess, fair enough. Chomsky's critique, which came the same year as Skinner's verbal behaviour, argued that in order for language to be learned, it must at some level have some kind of innate component. He called this in his later theory the universal grammar. And he says that really he doesn't believe that children learn language really any more than a bird necessarily learns to fly. It needs to have, if you like, practice. It needs to have exposure to a particular language. But learning a language is very different to a way a child would, for example, learn to spell or learn to read, which seem to be about language, but are much more effortful and much less natural processes. So there are innate structures. Children have a universal grammar. We're born with a knowledge of the way that language works. Now, this isn't the knowledge of this particular language that your parents might speak, so children aren't born with words or even the syntactic structure of English. What they know about is something about the objects of language and something about the way that these things go together. So children are born with innate principles in this universal grammar. They know at some unconscious level, not consciously, that language is made up of nouns, verbs, and these things go together in predictable ways. And the way in which they go together can, to some extent, vary from language to language. So they've got innate principles, but then there are parameters, and the parameters are like, if you think about it, being variables. These are things that the child needs to learn, but there's only a small number of them. So there's not an infinite number of things that a child needs to learn. So, for example, what Chomsky would say is that there's a part of an utterance which is called a head, and a head is the kind of event that the sentence is. This is a bit fiddly and complicated, but if we look at John has put the book on the table, that sentence in English, then the word put is what the sentence is about. It's not about a table, it's not particularly about John, it's not about a book, it's about something being put somewhere by somebody. So put is the kind of main aboutness of the sentence. It's what the sentence of the utterance is actually about. Now, English is head first. We put the head before we describe what was put and where it was put. In German, I'm not even going to pronounce that. I just lied. Buch auf den Tisch gelag. Absolutely terrible German, can't speak it at all. But the word put in German comes at the end. So head first, head last. Languages basically fall into two kinds. It's either a head first language or there's a head last language. And what Chomsky would say is that kids know that languages either fall into one of these two categories, head first, head last. And by a limited amount of exposure to language, when a child hears English and hears being put toward the beginning of the sentence, then the child knows that the language that they're hearing is a head first language, and will generalize that to all other utterances. So they'll start to produce utterances where head is put towards the beginning. If, on the other hand, the child is hearing German, they're realizing, again unconsciously, that this is a head last language, so they'll generalize that to all other utterances. So it's kind of like flipping switches. It's not learning a song, it's going, well, which language is it? Is it head first? Is it for head last? Does it have prepositions like English, or does it have postpositions like some other languages? And once you know and hear evidence for you the way your language does something, the child flicks and goes, this is the head first language, again unconsciously, and this is why learning language is easy. For kids, we have innate principles, the universal grammar, but we have a set of possibilities that we can choose from a small set, which are the parameters. And once evidence is provided for the way that language does something, e.g. head first, head last, then the switch is flipped, and the child can then generalize that to all other aspects of their language. A really nice example that Chomsky gives, this is exactly the same as the example he gives, because I don't believe it concerns football, but it's in otherwise identical to the one he gives in some of his early work. He shows the difficulty of doing something fairly simple, which is turning a statement into a question. So given a statement like the man is playing football, we can simply turn that into a question by taking the is that is before the word playing and move that to the front of the sentence, and when we move the word is to the front of a sentence, we end up with is the man playing football, which is a question. However, there are problems when we start to have sentences which have two ises. The man who is wearing blue shorts is playing football. Okay, there's a sentence, quite a complicated fiddly one, but one that we do hear relatively often. There are two alternatives. We could move the first is to the beginning. Now that might be tempting to a child, because if the child has been presented with simple sentences such as the man is playing football, then there's only one is in there, so you might be tempted to move that first one. However, that doesn't produce a grammatical sentence. Is the man who wearing blue shorts is playing football is ungrammatical, which is why, as we do in linguistics, we notate this by putting an asterisk after it showing it's grammatically incorrect. What we need to do is to take the second is the man who is wearing blue shorts playing football? That makes a perfectly grammatical sentence. Now the fact is, we can do this. And the fact is, as we'll see in a minute, young kids 4, 5 years of age can do this really easily. And you don't really get any evidence of kids moving the wrong is and producing that ungrammatical sentence. So what's going on? Well, what's going on there is actually the fact that kids recognize, again unconsciously, that language is hierarchically structured. Sentences, utterances are hierarchically structured. We have nouns, we have verbs, we have determiners, we have prepositions, we have all these kind of fancy things, adjectives, adverbs. But these fall into phrases. So actually what we've got here, to forward, is the man who is wearing blue shorts is about the man. It describes the man who is wearing blue shorts. The wearing blue shorts is telling you something more about the man. And then the other part is playing football, tells you something about what that man's doing. So we can see that these words, although there are a lot of words here, basically fall into two phrases. The noun phrase, which is about the principal object that we're talking about, the man, and what he's like, and the verb phrase, which is about what he's doing. Now, to back, if we read that question, we want to know whether he's playing football, not whether he's wearing blue shorts. So we're asking a question about what he's doing. In other words, about the verb phrase. Kids know that what you're doing, if you're trying to answer a question about the verb phrase, you need to take the is that applies to that verb phrase, not the is that applies to the noun phrase. And kids show this. So children never made errors like the first example said, he must know something about language. He must know some of this stuff about the fact that language is hierarchically organized, according to Chomsky, the fact that nouns and verbs fall into noun and verb phrases, prepositions fall into preposition phrases, and so on. And in Crane and Nakayama's classic 1986 study, they had questions very similar to this, in which they had a Jabba the Hutt puppet from Star Wars, and the kids were asked to ask Jabba, for example, whether the man who is wearing blue shorts is playing football, and they were given a little picture, and they asked to ask Jabba, and Jabba would answer as a puppet. And they got it right. At about 5 and 6 years of age, they would start to get these questions correct. They weren't showing the errors that you might expect if they were just learning by trial and error. And trial and error is very much the kind of Skinnerian view. You try something, if it works, you do it again. If it doesn't work, you try something else. They're being guided, it seems, by something. And Chomsky would argue that this is the innate principles and the universal grammar. So kids understand this. And this is what Chomsky's arguing. Now, Chomsky believed that language was innate. He argued that language was innate, but in his earlier writings he was reluctant to accept that language actually evolved by natural selection. I think he subsequently is more ready to accept that principle now, and he's written a few papers which attempt to describe it, but the real first attempt to take Chomsky and put an evolutionary spin on it was by work by Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom in 1990, a kind of landmark paper in evolutionary psychology called Natural Language and Natural Selection. They argue that like bodily organs, like the heart, like the liver, like the lungs, like the brain, language shows exquisite design. What does that mean? Well, as we saw earlier, language is hierarchically structured, it's fairly fussy about what goes where and how things go together. You have verb phrases, nouns, preposition phrases, all of these hierarchically structured. So language is incredibly well designed. Not that anybody designed it, but then nobody designed the heart. And they're arguing that although nobody designed it, natural selection did. It has obvious advantages for communication. You can share thoughts, give instructions, carry out procedures, tell people what you want them to do. You can work as a team using language. You can organize each other. There's a lot of neurological hardware supporting language in the brain. One of the weird things about the brain is that the brain weighs about 2% of our body weight, but uses about 20% of our energy. So the brain is costly. It must be doing something because there's a lot of costs associated with it. It also, big brains also make breaking your neck much more easily in humans, so there are costs associated with big brains. So language has costs because it needs big brains to do it. And finally, the vocal tract in humans, which has been adapted for language, makes us much more likely to choke than other animals. That many people have died from choking, and things like the Heimlich maneuver, which is a way of stopping people from choking when they've got something stuck in their throat, has saved many tens of thousands of lives since it was first implemented. So there's a lot of negatives associated with big brains, a lot of negatives associated with language, and there's a lot of neurological hardware there which suggests that there's some massive benefit there. Language is also learned extremely easily with little explicit teaching. You don't need to teach kids language. If you expose kids to language, then they will learn it. And that doesn't necessarily mean if you just play a tape of speech, kids will learn language. It has to be learned in an interactive sense. There has to be a purpose for it. It's not just hearing it. But as long as you talk to kids, and as long as kids have some degree of exposure to real language, then kids will learn language. So evidence there that language has evolved, and whether or not you believe in Chomsky's theory does make a plausible account as to how it might work. There are people who argue that Chomsky's wrong, but they still do propose a fair degree of innate hardware and innate knowledge which is required to support the language learning process. Children often ignore corrections even if you make them, and this is an example of a child completely ignoring the parent's attempt to correct the child's incorrect, as the parent sees it, grammar. So even though we try to teach kids language, often they just ignore us because it's something that they're learning, not something that we're teaching. And the evidence is overwhelming that that is the case.